Sunday, October 25th, 1931, I had just finished my records after the day's work in the hospital, and was just about to put on my black coat which I always wore for my Sunday's visit with my bright Elena, when the brakes of a car screeched in front of the lab door. Mario, husband of Elena's sister Nana, rushed in and told me breathlessly, "Elena has just died. Come with me." Now I knew the cause of the oppression which had gripped me all day long. We raced through the town. It was just 5 p.m. when we reached her house. More than a block away we could already hear the people moan and scream. There was a big crowd around the house. We had to break a passage through the people. Hoping against hope that something could be done, I requested for all the people to get out of the room. Then I went down to my knees before the bed. I tested her breath and heartbeats, but there was nothing to be heard above the screams of the people. I placed the Faraday testing electrode on her neck so that it covered the nerve region. There was no reaction. That moment, Dr. Gailey arrived. He, too, examined her to find that all life was gone. Mario tiptoed to my side, and in my desperation I called out, "If only you had come to me half an hour earlier, perhaps it wouldn't have been too late." "I drove as fast as I could," he mumbled. What more could I do? He had lost time trying all doctors in town, but found none at home. In halting words, he told me what had happened. On that fatal Sunday afternoon, her father had taken her again on an auto ride to town despite my warning. She had dressed herself for the occasion in her new silk dress, with all her jewelry, and she had waved to all the friends she had met in the streets. Nobody had suspected that this was her last farewell. Until finally she had collapsed in the car. Her father, supporting her limp form, had driven home at breakneck speed instead of driving to the nearby hospital, where we doctors might have saved her life. When he got home, his child was already dying. Her last words were for everybody to leave her room, with the exception of a young woman who always had been her best friend. Elena's jaws had dropped, but her eyes were bright and clear. They had a faraway look, and as I gazed into those beloved eyes, they seemed to become deeper and deeper like wells which, with magnetic power, drew me in. I could not tear my eyes away from her. I could look forever. With shock I noticed that already she had been stripped of all the finery she had worn in death, and that she was now clad in some castaway and dirty old shirt, which I had never seen before. Likewise I noted that all the jewelry which I had given her was gone. My poor darling Elena, with her body still warm, she had been robbed of everything she ever possessed on earth. Nana came in sobbing to ask whether Elena was still alive. "No, she will never come back again," I answered. Nana looked at her sister, horrified. "Please, close those eyes, doctor. Please close them. I can't bear the look of them. I can't stand her stare. It drives me crazy." "What a pity," I answered. "I could look into those beautiful eyes forever and ever." But then I bent down and gently closed the eyes of my bride Elena, because I did not want anybody else to do this for her. Nana quickly left to join the family in the next room, while I sat quietly by Elena's side until the undertaker came. Mr. Pritchard, the undertaker, at first discussed the matter with me, for there were documents to sign. I heard a great hubbub and confusion of voices, and all of a sudden her father burst into the death room. "I'm helpless. I don't know what to do. I'm in despair. Please help us, doctor. I know you thought the world of Elena. I know you will do this for her. See to it that she gets a decent funeral and a good place at the cemetery. I leave everything to you. I give you complete charge in everything to do just as you see fit. We poor people, we have nothing. I leave her to you." "All right," I said, "but you should have left her to me while still alive." He thanked me exuberantly. Then he called Mr. Pritchard into the death room and introduced me to the undertaker, and told him that I was in charge of all the arrangements according to my wish and to that of the deceased. I didn't think it was befitting to discuss these matters in the presence of my Elena. So I went with Mr. Pritchard to his funeral home. There I selected the coffin, the flowers, and whatever else was needed. But when the matter of the dress came up, I felt I had to speak to Nana after removal of the body. Nana, why did you take away Elena's clothes? Why did you put that dirty rag on her? I want you to go and immediately bring her new silk dress, the last one I gave her. As to her jewels, I will discuss that with you at a later time. Of course, Nana started to cry, but was sufficiently cowed so that after a few minutes she produced the dress. I handed it to Mr. Pritchard. Throughout these technicalities, I wondered over the fact that I was able calmly and deliberately to arrange all these things. The strange part of it was that with my brains I fully realized that Elena was dead, but that my heart, with a far greater force, told me she is not dead. It was probably because I listened to the voice of my heart much more than to that of my brain that the brain was enabled to keep on functioning in a reasonable manner. The body had been removed from the house. In the funeral parlor I had placed a big heart of roses on the coffin of my Elena, and I kept the vigil with her. Then the coffin with Elena and roses came back to her house. At night I returned to the hospital for a few hours' sleep. October 26th, the funeral was set for 5 p.m. I worked all of the day. At 4 I closed my office and dressed. There was a surprisingly large number of mourners. Masses of flowers formed almost a solid wall around my Elena's house. There was nobody in Elena's room. I took my seat near to the coffin so I could drink in all her beauty for a last time. Beneath the closed lids, her eyeballs seemed to have concentrated, and they were looking straight into my eyes so I could feel their stare like a hypnotic touch. I sat lonely at Elena's side among the flowers during this last hour. More and more people passed by the coffin, depositing more flowers, and the whole room now seemed to be filled with flowers and their overpowering fragrance. One thing which impressed me was the reverent silence of all these Latin peoples, who usually were so loud, being a Spanish custom. It was only I, however, who sensed Elena's spirit floating in the room, fairy-like or rather angel-like from flower to flower. Maybe all those people reverently respected my silence, communing with my bride in the casket, as there was no other living one inside Elena's death room. I noticed especially one wrinkled little old man who deposited flowers, bent down and broke into tears at her side and went out crying. Later I learned that this man had been Elena's former father-in-law. His was a human decency not for show, but for love of heart, which the husband lacked, for he never showed up. The undertaker awoke me from my reveries. The funeral procession was about to begin, and everybody had to take seats in the cars waiting outside. I said to Nana, "She hasn't one single piece of her jewelry on her." Thereupon Nana sobbingly produced at least the ivory necklace and the rose. I myself put on the necklace, and I wound the silver rosary around Elena's left wrist. Finally, Nana also gave the black velvet felt with the brilliant clasp, which Elena had loved so much and which belonged to her black silk dress, also one of the embroidered handkerchiefs which I had given Elena the day before her death. At the very last moment, when the coffin was about to be closed and everybody was out of the room, I took a letter from my breast pocket and put it under Elena's dress on her breast. Then I kissed her goodbye on the temple, which was the one place which had remained uncontaminated by other kisses. It was a very long procession, 100 cars, which followed my bride and me to her resting place. All along the way there sounded in my ears Beethoven's 7th Symphony. Mad as this must appear to most people, to me this funeral procession was like a wedding march, and the slow stepping of the pallbearers along the hearse in front of my car beating the proper measure for this symphony. At church the organ sounded with its angels' voices of a happy meeting in the better world. It was only then that I cried and cried from happiness. For now the long, sad, worldly struggle was all over. My bride was beyond malice, beyond unhappiness, beyond her pain. She was in the hands of God, the best, the gentlest hands that be. Father Moreau, who had but recently taken my Elena into the folds of the church, now spoke the last rites for her. The coffin sank into its grave when I thought, as did everybody else, it was all over. Some Cuban, whom I had never seen before, indulged in a piece of fiery oratory wherein he demanded punishment for the person responsible for her early death. Whether he meant me I did not know and cared less, but I thanked him for his righteous thoughts, and with a hand clasp I assured him of my sincere support of his idea. This, then, was what many, perhaps most people, would call the end. A strange kind of new life now began for me. It was something like a rebirth after these last 2 oppressing and depressing years. Now at least nobody could take my Elena away from me. Although I could not see her any longer, I felt her presence all the time. It was only natural that I went daily to the cemetery. What disturbed me there was the fact that, owing to the nature of the ground, hers was a shallow grave and by no means safe from water. In the dry season there was little danger, but I was worried at the thought of what would happen to my darling once the torrential rains started to come. There was no drainage of any kind in this cemetery. It seemed unfair that her beautiful form should perish from the water. The only possible way to prevent this was to build a concrete vault around the coffin, and to do it soon. In the meantime, I kept the mound of the grave covered with a piece of tarpaulin which I took from my plane. The edges of the tarpaulin I secured to the ground with stone, and all the flowers I laid on top. Now she was reasonably safe, at least until I could build her a tomb. Considering how often I have mentioned the strenuous relations between myself and Elena's family, readers will find it hard to understand why every night I went to her house. It was the memory, of course, which drew me there, the atmosphere of Elena lingering on, but that was exactly why I felt great sadness in finding her room desolate, with all of Elena's things removed from it. When I inquired, the parents told me that everything was burned, and that they abhorred this house where one of theirs had died, and that they were moving to some other part of town. I had the distinct feeling that I was not told the truth, and that not all the things I had given Elena had been destroyed. It was not the material value of these things, it was the memory connected with them, which made me say, "Now listen, if you are moving out, I'm going to rent this house for myself, even if I have to buy it. Moreover, you'd better be warned that the furniture and other things and jewelry I've given Elena were bought on the installment plan. If you want to keep these things for yourself, I will notify the company according to the contract, and you will have to pay the balance owing." They did not like that particular idea, and just as I had foreseen, the furniture was now produced from somewhere and placed back in Elena's room. Nothing had been burned except a few sheets and pillows, and the trunk which had been the family's. Delighted with the result, I now told them, "No matter whether you move or stay on, I'm going to live in my Elena's room, where she has lived and died, because it is here that I distinctly feel at home in her presence." To this they agreed and cooperated from then on. I slept in Elena's bed. It still preserved the sweet scent of her hair. For years I had not slept so well as I did in Elena's atmosphere. Nana had returned the old kimono last worn by Elena, but she kept all the other dresses. I suppose she had need of it. Regarding the jewels, Mother told me that she had them all and none was missing and they were locked up. "Keep them," I told her, "until the tomb is ready. Then I'll adorn her with all her jewels, because I don't want anybody else to wear them." "Ah, but what's the use? There won't be anything left of Elena but bones," she said. "Don't you believe it, Mother. I'll take good care of her. I'll not permit her body to decay, and if in the grave Elena should lose her hair, I'll buy new hair and put it back on her head." "Don't do that," said the mother. "Don't use other people's hair. Put her own hair back. I have some which she had cut off a year ago." At these words she opened her dresser and took out, wrapped in paper, the beautiful long tresses of my Elena, which had been cut off a year ago when she decided to wear her hair in the American style. This package she gave me, for which I thanked her with all my heart. Having resigned herself to my determination, Mother was now a very much changed woman indeed. And in a way so was the father too. He assured me that her room was now my own for the rest of my life. Both were satisfied that I would take care of Elena and were convinced of my undying love for her. I disconnected the radio in my room, which I had purchased for Elena, that from now on was to be silent as a tribute to her death. The father had become restless. He had no peace of mind and rarely was at home. Mother had become very quiet, but the real reason for this was that she had fallen sick. There was something the matter with her circulation. She took treatment by some Cuban doctor, but it didn't help. Instead, it got worse. The heart became affected and the arms and legs were gradually paralyzed. I did not wish to interfere. After all, she had every right to choose her doctor as she pleased. One night, however, her condition was so painful that she called me to her bed. "Please help me, Carlos. The other doctor doesn't help me but makes me worse, and I am sure that you can do me good." I made a careful analysis of her condition, and after I had found the proper medication, she was cured within a week. Now the last barrier was broken down. She was sincerely grateful for what I had done for her, and even more for my care for Elena. At last there was someone who showed sincere attachment. She thanked me with all of her heart. All this time I used every free hour planning and constructing the tomb. I bought a larger plot around Elena's grave, sufficient for a family tomb. There I sat every afternoon after work on a little chair, drawing plans and waiting for the mason, who had promised to help me with the work. This man, however, with whom I had contracted, proved to be unreliable. He didn't show up, but kept me waiting, and precious time was lost. Meantime, the first heavy rains drenched the cemetery, and I became very much concerned over my Elena, especially since I suspected odor developing from the shallow grave. In desperation, I went in search of another concrete worker. Finally, I discovered one, and almost immediately we commenced work on the tomb. But before we could start, it was necessary to obtain a disinterment permit to remove the coffin from the site for temporary storage at a funeral home. It took us about a month to build the tomb, but then another month was needed to allow for the concrete to harden, and for the finishing of the interior another month. Disinterment revealed that rains had indeed soaked the coffin, and that moreover it had been partly crushed when a couple of grave diggers had trampled down the ground too hard after the funeral. It was with dire anticipation that I now approached the urgent task of taking Elena out of the damaged coffin and placing her into a new and stronger casket I had bought. Towards this purpose the mortician and I arranged it so that there were no other dead in the morgue at the date for the rebedding of her body. In preparation I had bought and brought all that could possibly be needed: new sheets, pillows, sterile cotton, gauze, chemicals, and sprays. I also had built in my spare time an incubation tank, and had placed it in the morgue just in case it should be needed. This done, I took a taxi and hastened to Elena's house to fetch her jewels, which now were to be restored to her. Mother raised no difficulty over this. She gladly handed me the little box filled with the glittering toys, and I hastened back. After all the customary sanitary precautions had been taken, I opened the seals of the vault for which I held the key. The inner coffin, much damaged, became visible. Together we slid it out and set it on the concrete floor. The opening of the lid gave us considerable trouble owing to the demolished boards lying inside on the body, and because its lining inside had become attached to Elena's face and body. Through careful work, I was able to cut away this silken lining from the lid. The contents were now laid bare. As the first step, I sprayed diluted formalin all over the shrouded body in ample quantities. This was for disinfection and also to harden the body tissues before we undertook to detach from the skin the drapery which had become glued to it. Decay had set in a most disheartening manner. Only with the greatest care was I able to peel the pieces of textile from the body. This took hours. We then lifted the body out of the coffin and laid it on a table with a clean sheet. Having sprayed the body all over again, I now proceeded to sponge her face with a specially prepared solution, and also her hands and feet. With dismay, I discovered that in view of the damage already done, much more cleaning was required than could be done in the one night I had the morgue at my disposal. Till dawn I worked with every energy, appalled at the negligence of the mortician who had failed to embalm the coffin itself, which would have prevented much of the decay, because it was the coffin which smelled awful, not the body. When morning came, my sweet bride was freed from all outward signs of decay and from that of odor. When the mortician came to work, we placed her on thick layers of sterile cotton, and after I sprayed her form all over with eau de cologne, we now covered it all around with similar layers of sterile cotton. This done, we lifted her into her new coffin, and then this coffin into the new outer metal coffin which I had selected. This one was sealed all around with screws. The casket was of the airtight type, held together by 100 screws. The next day, many people came to the funeral home wanting to see Elena, but I had left instructions that under no circumstances were the coffins to be opened. This because I felt that Elena was not yet in a condition to be seen. A few nights thereafter, when I could again have the use of the morgue, I took Elena out of the inner coffin and placed her into my specially made incubator tank. After this had been completely sealed, a task which took till midnight, I poured into the top valve of the tank a certain solution which I had prepared for her, both antiseptic and nourishing for body cells. This I kept pouring in until the tank was completely filled. The tank was then placed into the casket. Now I felt easier, at least for the time being. Elena was protected against further decay. Now the tomb was finished, and it looked more like a pleasant summer residence than a burial place, and that it really was for my dear bride. This was exactly what I had desired for her, and I felt sure that she would like this, her new little house. Onlookers passing by said they would like to move in it and make it their house. The night before she was to move into her new residence, I wrote a certain letter, and in the morning took it with me to the tomb. The undertaker did the placement of the casket, and then he left me, and I laid down the crucifix on top of it, and lighted the little votive lights in the niche above her head, lights which from now on were to burn there day and night. This done, I closed the little curtains of blue silk, which were to prevent curious people from peeping in, and saying goodbye to my bride for today, I left her little house, carefully locking its door with 3